Vienna, 1692. She was 23, coughing blood into lace, born to inherit two empires, Spain and Austria. But her lungs collapsed before any crown touched her head. Her name was Maria Antonia, the product of royal incest, the cost of dynastic ambition. She died quietly, and history barely blinked. She was born into a house of mirrors, where every reflection looked back on itself. A dynasty so obsessed with purity, it folded inward, again and again, until the branches of the family tree no longer branched, but looped. Maria Antonia of Austria came into the world on January 18, 1669, in Vienna, the capital of a decaying yet stubborn empire. She was the daughter of Emperor Leopold III and Infanta Margarita Teresa of Spain. Her father was her mother's uncle. Her grandfather was also her great-uncle. Their union, like so many before them, was not born from love, but from a relentless pursuit of consolidation, of land, power, and bloodlines. From the moment she took her first breath, Maria Antonia was a body marked by design. Her very existence was a mathematical equation written in chromosomes that had been recycled too often. She was both Austrian and Spanish, both Habsburg and Habsburg, a living bridge between two halves of a dynasty obsessed with itself. Her bones were too delicate. Her skin, paper-thin and almost translucent under candlelight, was praised by courtiers as porcelain-like, an aesthetic flattery that masked the truth. That she bruised easily, that she tired quickly, that her frame, while elegant, was never robust. Her lower jaw was narrow, her mouth tight, and her breathing often shallow. Doctors noted her frailty, but to say so aloud would have meant questioning the Habsburgs themselves. Instead, the palace called her beautiful. "She has her mother's eyes," whispered one lady-in-waiting. "And her grandfather's strength," claimed a diplomat. But behind every compliment lay the unspoken truth. Maria Antonia was fragile, because her blood had been folded too many times into itself. And yet she was not raised like a girl who might break. She was trained like an heir. From infancy, she was placed under strict regimens, physical, intellectual, spiritual. Her days were divided by bells and tutors. She studied languages: Spanish, Latin, German, French. She was taught history not to understand it, but to uphold it. The portraits on the palace walls were not ancestors. They were blueprints. She was expected to mimic them, to embody them. Her mother, Margarita Teresa, died when Maria Antonia was just 6. The Empress, a young woman herself, had suffered from similar health issues, recurring illnesses, slow recoveries, physical exhaustion. Rumors swirled about her cause of death: consumption, infection, fatigue. But all agreed on one thing: her body had been too weak to carry the burden of royal expectation. And now, that burden passed to her daughter. Maria Antonia was told she was special, that she was the future of Spain, the jewel of Austria, God's answer to succession. These were not compliments. They were instructions. She was expected to be everything her mother couldn't. The priests said her lineage was sacred. The doctors said nothing. The portraits kept watching. Her father, Leopold I, was not an unfeeling man, but he was an emperor first and a parent second. His love came in the form of arrangements, assigning the best tutors, choosing the finest gowns, commissioning miniature portraits to be sent to Madrid and Naples. He made sure she was known, but not necessarily seen. She was protected, but not heard. And so, from childhood, Maria Antonia learned to smile without speaking. She learned to bow before questions could be asked. She learned to hide the tremors in her hands during Mass, to breathe slower when the dizziness came, to press her fingers against the inside of her wrists to slow her pulse. She learned how to appear whole, because weakness was not allowed. Not in her lineage, not in her role, and certainly not in her body. Medical science in the 17th century was a theater of guesswork wrapped in ritual. Bleeding was still common. Trepanation, drilling into the skull to release bad humors, was considered legitimate for melancholy and hysteria. The uterus was blamed for everything, and women's illnesses were, more often than not, dismissed as spiritual or hysterical unless they were fatal. Even then, they were spoken of in whispers. Maria Antonia's ailments were chronic, but chronic pain was not dramatic. It didn't bleed on the floor or scream in the night. It came quietly, in fatigue, in nausea, in the shortness of breath after climbing palace stairs. And so it was ignored. What mattered more was her blood. Not the blood she coughed, but the blood she carried. The blood of Charles V, of Philip II, of so many kings and queens whose faces she memorized on coinage and tapestry. Every time she fell ill, there were prayers but no solutions, oils and relics, not rest, penance and fasting, not nourishment. She was not allowed to recover. She was told to endure, and she did. Because from birth, Maria Antonia had never belonged to herself. She belonged to Vienna, to Madrid, to the ghost of her mother and the will of her father. She belonged to the negotiations written in ink by men who saw her womb as a bridge and her spine as a line on a map. She was not a daughter. She was a strategy. Her childhood passed inside gold-lined rooms, beneath frescoes of saints and martyrs. So many women who died quietly for causes greater than themselves. She listened to their stories. She lit candles in their names. She dreamed of peace. But peace was not a part of her inheritance. Only duty, only blood, and breath, and silence. And so, while the court celebrated her beauty and praised her grace, no one noticed how often she sat instead of stood. No one tracked how her hands trembled when she reached for quills. No one measured how much time she spent alone by windows, watching the sky. No one asked if she was well, because she was born to be useful, not well. And in the House of Habsburg, usefulness meant obedience, and obedience meant silence. And silence is how she began to disappear, even while she was still alive. Maria Antonia did not learn to dream. She learned to prepare. While other girls imagined love stories whispered beneath cypress trees or secret letters hidden in bodices, she was trained to walk hallways as if they were borders, to enter rooms as if they were courts of law, and to sit still under portraits of ancestors whose eyes judged from above, daring her to be worthy. She was not raised to rule. She was raised to be placed. From the age of 7, her world was divided between two maps, Austria and Spain. Her tutors spoke of Spanish succession as if it were a question only she could answer. She memorized the names of uncles she would never meet, practiced signing letters in Spanish script, and repeated prayers in Latin for monarchs whose candles were still burning. Her value lay not in who she was, but in what she could connect. She was a living hinge between empires, an offering sculpted from bloodlines and obligation. Her lessons began at dawn. Before the birds, before the bells. Theology first, because obedience to God was the foundation of obedience to the crown. Then languages, German with her nursemaid, Spanish with a Castilian tutor, French from a court visitor, and Latin from a monk who spoke more with his eyes than his mouth. Statecraft followed. Lessons in treaties, territories, and royal precedents. She studied war maps as though they were family trees, and family trees as if they were plans for war. Every detail was curated, every movement rehearsed, her posture, her intonation, even the angle of her smile in diplomatic portraits. When ambassadors came to court, she was presented like a jewel, softened by candlelight, dressed in stiff brocade that itched beneath her collar, hair brushed to perfection until her scalp ached. She stood for hours, smiling politely, her feet burning, her lungs tight in the corset her governess laced, until she fainted once behind a tapestry. That was not spoken of. Because Maria Antonia was not permitted frailty, she was a symbol, a promise made flesh. And symbols must not fall. The Holy Roman Empire treated daughters like assets. Assets must be maintained, polished, and moved when necessary. She was told, again and again, that her role was sacred, that she was chosen, that God had placed her in a lineage where sacrifice was an honor, and that pain was the burden of queens. She repeated this to herself as she knelt in cold chapels, praying for strength she was not born with. At court she smiled. At night she coughed. Into handkerchiefs, into sleeves, sometimes into the pillow when she was alone. Her maids whispered, "It's only the weather." But Vienna winters do not stain linen with crimson. Still, the plan for her future marched forward. In Madrid, King Charles II, her cousin, was weak, feeble in body, frail in mind, childless, and Europe waited like wolves circling an injured deer. Every house, Bourbon, Habsburg, Savoy, calculated its next move. If the Spanish line fell, a continent would shudder. Wars could start from empty cradles, and Maria Antonia was a cradle. At 13, she was shown portraits of cousins, men she might one day marry. She was told to choose with her heart, but instructed which one to favor. Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria, young, ambitious, politically acceptable. A cousin, but distant enough to ease concerns, close enough to please the Habsburgs. She did not protest, because protest was not in her nature. It had never been allowed to grow. Instead, she studied him. She memorized his achievements, victories against the Ottomans, his love for art and horses, his devotion to the Catholic faith. She asked to read his letters. She examined his portrait until she knew the crease above his brow and the slope of his jaw better than her own reflection. She wrote poems she never sent, practiced phrases of affection she would never speak. But when the engagement was announced, her heart did not leap. It sighed, not because he was cruel or unkind, but because the future had never been a choice. It had always been a command. She was 16 when the marriage was formalized. 16 and already weary. The court in Vienna erupted in ceremony. Musicians played for days. Tapestries were commissioned, new gowns ordered, and foreign guests received with choreographed splendor. The union was celebrated as a masterstroke of diplomacy. Austria, Bavaria, and Spain held together by one womb. Maria Antonia walked down an aisle lined with candles, her hands trembling beneath gloves perfumed with orange blossom. Her face glowed with powder. Her eyes did not. At the altar, she looked at Maximilian and smiled. It was the smile she had been taught. The night after the wedding, she was left alone in a foreign bed, in a foreign chamber, waiting for a man she barely knew to enter and confirm the union with silence. And when the door closed behind him and the candles burned low, no music played. No court watched. There was no treaty in the room, only two cousins, two dynasties, two bodies sculpted by politics and shadowed by ghosts. That night, the maids found her the next morning with blood on the sheets and tears crusted on her cheeks. She said nothing. Neither did they. Because it had happened. And now the work could begin. From then on, every letter from Vienna asked the same question in different ways. Is she with child? Has she quickened? Is there hope? Because Maria Antonia was no longer a daughter. She was an investment. And kingdoms do not ask how the investment feels, only whether it will yield. So she answered in the only way she could. She sat through dinners with her back straight, even as nausea churned. She walked through halls with her head held high, though her limbs trembled. She smiled for diplomats while pain gnawed her ribs. And when she was alone, she pressed her hands to her belly and prayed, not for happiness, but for success, not for peace, but for results, because love was never promised, survival was never guaranteed, but expectation, that was constant. It sat beside her at every meal, followed her down every corridor, and breathed behind her shoulder at every ceremony. She was not the queen of anything, yet. But she belonged to everything, to Austria, to Spain, to the calculations of ministers who never met her, and priests who blessed her without knowing the sound of her voice. She was a symbol, a conduit, a necessary function of empire. She was Maria Antonia, and she had already disappeared behind the silk curtain of her name. In the spring of 1685, beneath vaults of gold and clouds of incense, Maria Antonia became a wife. She was 16. The ceremony was opulent, as all imperial ceremonies were, designed not for love, but for demonstration. Each gesture was calculated, each hymn rehearsed, each jewel placed with care to signal not affection, but alliance. As her veil was lifted before the altar, she stood not merely before her cousin, Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria, but before a watching continent, eager to see if the Habsburg experiment would once again produce stability from silence. She said the words she had memorized. She knelt when she was told. She kissed the ring with the right amount of pressure. And when the choir sang of divine union, her lips moved in prayer. But her eyes remained still. There was no joy in her step that evening, only weight. Because Maria Antonia knew what no one dared speak aloud. She was not marrying a man. She was marrying a mission. Maximilian was young, ambitious, and widely regarded as charming. He had fought against the Ottomans, won honors, danced with grace, and spoke with confidence. His portraits portrayed him as a golden-haired figure of strength, draped in velvet and framed in ambition. But to Maria Antonia, he was a stranger shaped by expectation, much like herself. Two polished masks, positioned together in a play neither of them had written. That night, the palace quieted as guests withdrew, bellies full and voices hoarse from congratulation. Torches flickered in the corridors. The scent of roses clung to the linens. In a bed too wide for comfort, she waited. The door creaked. He entered. No one spoke of what followed. But the next morning, when the sheets were inspected by waiting hands, red marked the center, proof of consummation, proof of duty fulfilled. The maids nodded. The chamberlain made a note. The empire exhaled, and Maria Antonia began her new life, one in which her body would no longer be her own, but the property of dynastic strategy. She was moved to Munich soon after. The Bavarian court was colder in temperament, stricter in hierarchy, and less forgiving than Vienna. Here, she was no longer the daughter of the emperor, but the consort of a rising elector, expected to carry herself with decorum, piety, and silent fecundity. She wrote letters home, but never too many. In her correspondence, she was always cheerful, always healthy, always hopeful. She wrote what was expected, folded in perfumed pages, sealed with wax that bore her insignia, but not her truth. The truth was something else. In this new world, she woke early to nausea that lingered long after morning. Her hands trembled more often now. The sharp pains in her ribs returned. Her skin grew pale, not from elegance, but from anemia. And her breath, always short since childhood, now rasped at night, causing maids to rise in the dark to check if she was still alive. Still, there was no rest. There were masses to attend, feasts to sit through, portraits to pose for, and letters to write, not in her voice, but in the voice of expectation. She is adjusting well. Her health is strong. She is hopeful for an heir. The court of Bavaria had its own rhythm, its own shadows, and Maximilian, though never cruel, was not present. He traveled often, campaigns, councils, visits to other courts. When he was home, he dined late and spoke of politics. Maria Antonia listened, smiled, and asked appropriate questions. They shared beds, but not thoughts. She obeyed as she had been taught. Love was not the currency of royalty. Compliance was. In this silence, Maria Antonia began to fold inward. She withdrew from dances. She stopped riding. She spent more time in her chambers, where the curtains remained drawn and the air grew heavy with stillness. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed. They offered herbal teas and whispered suggestions. Perhaps she is with child. Perhaps it is the change of seasons. Perhaps it is nothing. No one asked her directly. No one ever did. And so she smiled when spoken to. She nodded when addressed. But more and more, she said nothing at all. The palace began to talk. Not loudly, not openly, but in small circles behind folding fans and between verses of sacred music. She is delicate, they said. Too quiet, they muttered. Not hardy enough to carry a royal line. Maria Antonia heard them. The walls in courts are thin, but she said nothing. Because what could she say? That her limbs ached? That her vision blurred when she stood too quickly? That the weight in her chest was not sorrow, but something physical, pulsing beneath her ribs? That she cried not from fear, but from the bone-deep knowledge that no one would stop this machine she had been placed in? No. She remained the same, dutiful, beautiful, silent. In public, she held her husband's arm. In private, she whispered prayers. At night, she wrote poems she never shared, lines about birds without wings, about statues carved too early, about mirrors that reflect nothing. And then came the first bleeding, not of her own, but of hope. The miscarriage was not announced. It never is. Not at first. But maids whispered of linens burned, of physicians leaving her chamber pale-faced. of her silence lasting days. The court noticed her absence from Vespers. When she returned, thinner and paler than before, she smiled wider than usual. It was the kind of smile that terrified those who recognized it. But Maximilian did not speak of it. The court moved on. Another feast, another letter to Vienna, another attempt. Because failure, in royal terms, was never permanent. It was merely delayed expectation. She would try again, and again, and again. And each time she would walk into it with the same quiet, the same practiced grace, the same body that was slowly unraveling beneath layers of brocade and pearl. No one asked what she wanted, because Maria Antonia was not meant to want. She was meant to produce, to endure, to vanish quietly behind the success of a future she had no say in. And so she kept bleeding, not just from her womb, but from the seams of her life. And no one listened to the sound. Her womb was not hers. It belonged to the crowns of Austria and Spain, to the ambitions of Vienna and Madrid, to ministers who counted days and calculated births with the same urgency they reserved for treaties and troop movements. From the moment Maria Antonia was wed, her body became geography, dissected, monitored, mapped in whispers and letters sealed with royal wax. She conceived quickly, or so they thought. The court rejoiced, but quietly. Habsburg restraint did not allow for overt celebrations so early. Still, congratulatory letters poured in. Prayers were said. A gold rosary was sent from Madrid. And the waiting began. 9 months. 9 long, fragile, heavily scrutinized months. But the child never came. They did not call it a miscarriage, not allowed. The physicians spoke of natural interruption and divine judgment. The ladies in waiting said nothing, only folded stained sheets into baskets and looked away. The chambermaids lit candles. The midwives were dismissed. The silence that followed was heavy, more dangerous than grief, more suffocating than pain. It clung to Maria Antonia's skin, colder than the marble floors she now rarely walked upon. Her health, already brittle, unraveled further. And yet, no one paused. Because the child she had failed to bring into the world was not merely a child, it had been a cornerstone in the architecture of succession. Her failure was not personal. It was political, dynastic, historical. Spain's future had trembled on the edge of a crib that was never filled. So they tried again. The court physicians, summoned from Vienna and Munich, examined her with a detachment of engineers assessing a failing mechanism. Tonic after tonic was prescribed. Syrups of crushed pearls, wine infused with herbs, tinctures of myrrh and ash. They bled her for balance. They fed her mercury for strength. They confined her to her chambers to preserve the delicate equilibrium of gestation, insisting that stillness was the only path to success. Maria Antonia obeyed. Because saying no had never been part of her vocabulary, she had been trained to bend, to submit, to fulfill. Her days became monotony laced with dread. She would lie on brocade cushions, hands resting on her abdomen, listening to the faint movements within. Every twitch, every flutter was noted in a journal by her governess. When she grew dizzy, they propped her up. When she fainted, they prayed. When her legs swelled, they whispered it meant she was carrying a boy. But the bleeding returned, quietly, then heavily. No screams, no cries, only a single sob that escaped into her pillow when the midwife closed the door and said, "It is done." No body was shown, no name was given, no funeral was held. The second loss came with less ceremony. The court had learned not to expect joy from her chambers. Whispers shifted from hope to doubt. A few began to ask, carefully, cautiously, whether her constitution was too frail, whether Maximilian might need another match. But divorce was not an option. She was too royal to discard, too valuable in blood, too dangerous to insult without risking international fracture. So she remained, and they tried again. Each attempt became more clinical, more invasive. She was watched constantly. Her meals were measured, her steps counted. If she coughed too hard, a doctor was summoned. If she missed a meal, the chaplain was called. Her body was not allowed to live. It was instructed, and still she did not complain. Because to complain was to betray duty. And duty, to Maria Antonia, was sacred, even if it crushed her. By the third pregnancy, her health had declined so sharply that even her husband began to notice. Maximilian returned from campaign to find her thinner, paler, moving through corridors like a ghost of the woman he had married. Her voice was quieter now, her eyes cloudier, her movements restrained not by etiquette, but by fatigue. And yet, when he entered her chamber, she smiled, not because she felt safe, but because she had learned that to smile was to survive. She lost the child again, and this time the bleeding nearly killed her. She was found unconscious, lips blue, breath shallow, surrounded by linen soaked so thoroughly in blood that a maid later fainted at the sight of it. The palace panicked. Priests were summoned. Doctors argued. Nurses cried. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of fevered murmurs, speaking in fragments, sometimes to her mother, sometimes to saints, sometimes to no one. And still, she lived. But the court no longer celebrated. They no longer whispered of heirs. They no longer sent rosaries. They began instead to prepare. If she bore a child again, it would be her last. Her physicians warned Maximilian in coded language. Her bones had thinned. Her lungs had weakened. Her pulse fluttered like a wounded bird. Another pregnancy, they said, might break her completely. And yet, she conceived again, because she had to, because there was no other way to stay useful, to stay necessary, to stay present in a system that only acknowledged her if she carried something larger than herself. And so she went to bed again, with hope layered in fear. She prayed in silence. She drank the bitter syrups. She endured the hourly checks, the endless scrutiny, the unbearable pressure of being the container for Europe's next war or peace. Her belly grew, her face hollowed, her body swelled, her breath shortened, her limbs trembled, her smile cracked. But the court dared to hope again, because this time the signs were better. The bleeding had not come. The child moved. Her appetite returned briefly. The priests declared it a good omen. Ministers wrote early drafts of treaties. Madrid readied cradles. And Maria Antonia? She remained silent, because silence had become her second language, because hope was a flame that burned more painfully than fear, because she knew that to speak of the ache in her lungs, the stabbing beneath her ribs, the cough that tasted like rust, was to risk everything. So she held it in, until the very end. In the cold winter of 1692, beneath chandeliers that flickered like stars about to die, Maria Antonia gave birth to a boy. His cries were sharp, his limbs thin but strong. His lungs did not falter. The court exploded in joy. He was named Joseph Ferdinand, a name thick with history, chosen not for sentiment, but for signal. It was a message to Madrid, to Vienna, to every throne watching the slow collapse of Spain's royal line. This child would be the solution. A single infant, barely minutes into life, now bore the weight of 2 empires. But Maria Antonia could not hold him. Not immediately. She was too weak. Her skin had turned nearly translucent. Her lips pale as candle wax. The sheets beneath her were damp with sweat and something darker. Her breaths came shallow, gasped between moments of fevered silence. The midwife whispered reassurances, crossing herself between instructions. The priest stood nearby, just in case. The child was removed, presented, blessed, inspected. Ministers clapped. Letters were dispatched within the hour. But the mother remained in bed, eyes half closed, whispering to no one. Her body, drained by months of controlled suffering, had reached the end of its fragile capacity. They said she had done her duty, that she had succeeded, that the birth of Joseph Ferdinand secured her place in history. And yet, history did not pause to check if she could still walk. The bells of Bavaria rang out in celebration. Vienna rejoiced. Madrid issued prayers of thanksgiving. Painters were summoned to capture the newborn's likeness, his mother's portrait to be updated with infant in arms, a fiction since she barely touched him. Maria Antonia tried. She asked for her child, but her arms were too heavy. Her chest burned. When she reached forward, her vision swam, and the world tilted violently. She collapsed back into her pillows, mouth open, fingers twitching. No one noticed, because the child was healthy, and that was what mattered. For the first time in years, the Spanish succession seemed momentarily secure. Here was a prince with Habsburg blood, yet distant enough to unite rival factions. Here was a compromise in flesh. A boy with Austria in his bones and Spain in his name. But his mother lay dying. The court did not say so. Not openly. They spoke in euphemisms. She is recovering slowly. The delivery was taxing. Her spirit remained strong. Doctors came and went, suggesting vapors, opiates, and boiled infusions that she could no longer swallow. Her lungs rattled. Her fever rose. She coughed through the night, her lace handkerchiefs soaked in blood. And when dawn came, she could barely speak. Her hands, once pale and delicate, were now cracked and cold. Her eyes sunken, ringed with violet. She could not stand. She could barely lift her head. But she still asked for Joseph. And once, just once, he was brought to her. A nursemaid held him, swaddled tightly, his face red from crying. She tried to touch his cheek, her fingers trembling. For a moment, his tiny eyes met hers, and something softened in the room. But then she coughed, violently, and the wet sound of blood startled the child. The maid rushed him away. That would be the only time she saw him clearly. In the days that followed, the physicians reported deterioration. Her breathing grew more labored, her coughs more frequent. She spoke less. Then, not at all. The priest administered final rites, though no one called them that aloud. Her husband was away, again, inspecting fortifications or attending political matters too far for urgency. Her father, Emperor Leopold sent word through clerics and court messengers, but did not come. She died without fanfare. No candle was extinguished in the palace when her last breath slipped through her cracked lips. No solemn bell tolled. There were no sobs echoing in the halls, no wails from loyal courtiers. Her passing was swift, but silent, like a book closed mid-sentence, like a letter sealed and never opened. She had delivered the heir. Her work was complete. Her death was not a tragedy. It was a calculation. They buried her in quiet ceremony. Attended by the appropriate number of nobles, recited the correct prayers, laid her to rest beneath stone carved with titles she never fully wore. Queen of Spain in waiting, Electress of Bavaria, Archduchess, Mother of the Spanish Solution. There was no mention of the miscarriages, no mention of the fever that scorched her from the inside. No record of the prayers whispered alone at night, or the poems never read, or the cough stifled into the silk of embroidered pillows. There was only the child, the boy who had survived, Joseph Ferdinand. He became a figure of hope. He was raised not in mourning, but in ambition. The son of a woman forgotten the moment she succeeded. A political pawn wrapped in ribbons and surrounded by ministers. They painted him. They praised him. They planned for him. But he would not last. The strength that had bypassed his mother briefly filled his frame, long enough to offer Europe a moment of fragile peace, then failed him. At age 6, he died. Smallpox, perhaps, or some inherited weakness. The records are inconsistent. The causes debated. The result the same. Her sacrifice led to nothing. No treaties were saved. No wars were prevented. No thrones were secured. Her name faded from conversations, then from memories, then from books. She became a line in a genealogy, a link in a chain that broke anyway, a portrait without a story. And the bed where she died was remade the next morning, as if she had never slept there at all. She was 23, too young to die, but far too used up to live. Maria Antonia of Austria, the child of empires and the bride of strategy, had fulfilled her purpose in the cold arithmetic of royal lineage. Her body, thin as the paper that bore her titles, had given the world what it wanted. A boy with dynastic potential. And now, like a letter already read, she was folded away. Her lungs collapsed slowly. It wasn't a dramatic unraveling. No sudden collapse in a crowded court, no gasping confession in a velvet-lined bed. Her end came in increments, one shallow breath at a time, one fevered night bleeding into the next, one whispered prayer dissolving into hoarse silence. It began days after Joseph Ferdinand's birth. She had been too weak to hold him, too dizzy to sit up, too breathless to speak for long. Yet no one expected death. They expected exhaustion, perhaps a long convalescence, maybe a withdrawal from court events. But not this. Not death. Not from a woman who had just secured 2 bloodlines. But tuberculosis, consumption as it was then called, was not selective. It did not care for titles. It did not pause for newborns. It did not ask permission. The disease had lived in her for years, quiet and patient, waiting for the final stress to tear the last threads of her health. Her body had fought miscarriages, malnutrition, persistent fevers, and the expectations of 2 empires. She had not rested. She had not been allowed to. Now there was nothing left to fight with. Her cough deepened. At first, the doctors prescribed broths, herbs, prayers. They spoke of balance, of the need to restore humors, of purging the wetness from the lungs. They bled her. They applied hot cloths. They whispered that childbirth had simply strained her, that rest would cure what ambition had frayed. But there was no rest. Her body had been a battlefield for too long. The palace tried to hide it. For days, they restricted access to her chambers. The curtains were drawn. Visitors were kept at bay. Messages were filtered. Publicly, she was recovering. Privately, she was drowning in her own blood. The sound of her breathing, wet, shallow, erratic, became a rhythm of dread. She began to hallucinate. In the early hours, she muttered names of people who weren't there. Her mother's name, her father's name, saints she had once memorized in catechism. Once, a maid heard her whisper the name of the child she lost in her second pregnancy. An infant never named, never mourned, never buried. She had never forgotten. But the court had. No one asked what she remembered. They brought holy relics. They anointed her with oils. They placed crucifixes in her hands, cold metal against burning skin. She held them tightly, not from faith, perhaps, but from desperation. Something solid, something not fading. Her husband was absent. Maximilian had left shortly after the birth, summoned by affairs of state. Perhaps he believed she would recover. Perhaps he could not bear to watch. Or perhaps he had already accepted that this was the cost. One wife in exchange for a son who might be a king. He sent letters. They were formal, respectful, distant. Her father, Emperor Leopold I, did not come. He ruled an empire. He governed from afar. He issued instructions, requested updates, dispatched confessors, but no comfort, no embrace, no farewell. In her final days, Maria Antonia was alone in a palace that had never felt like home. She was surrounded by people, yet untouched by presence. Surrounded by symbols, yet stripped of identity. The walls were gilded, the furniture grand, but no one in that room loved her. Not really. Not as a daughter, not as a wife, not as a woman. She coughed again, this time deep enough to bring blood to her lips. The doctor turned away. He had seen it before. Consumption leaves little dignity in death. It takes voice first, then breath, then movement. By the end, the patient is often aware of everything and capable of nothing. It is not loud. It is not noble. It is slow, suffocating, and final. The nurses closed the doors, lit candles, sprinkled holy water. Someone began to recite the rosary. She tried to join. Her lips moved, but no sound came. On the evening of December 24th, 1692, Christmas Eve, Maria Antonia died. No final words were recorded, no dramatic gesture, just the stillness of a young woman who had borne too much for too long. One heartbeat stopped, and the empires continued. The news was not met with mourning. It was met with calculation. Spain's ministers noted the implications for succession. Bavaria's court prepared the infant's transition to prominence. Vienna issued the appropriate condolences, but quickly turned its attention to the child. Maria Antonia's death was not a tragedy. It was a logistical shift. She had fulfilled her purpose. That was enough. Her funeral was dignified, but restrained. She was buried in Munich, wrapped in cloth embroidered with imperial insignias. Her name was etched on stone, her titles listed carefully. But there were no mourning veils across Europe. No black-draped courtrooms, no masses of grieving citizens. There were only documents, adjustments, letters, and silence. Even in death, she was efficient. Even in the grave, she remained an instrument of dynastic engineering. The priests said she died a holy death, having brought forth life and submitted to God's will. The doctors said her constitution had always been fragile. The ministers said her son would unite Europe. And the women who had cared for her quietly packed away her gowns, her combs, her unfinished letters. None of them cried. No one stayed long in her chambers after she left. The sheets were changed. The windows opened. And the candles, still burning, were snuffed out without ceremony. Maria Antonia of Austria was 23 years old. She had no coronation, no reign, no voice in policy, no lasting legacy. She was born to be a queen, but died as a vessel, and no one ever asked if she had wanted any of it. He was just a boy, swaddled in layers of silk and buried in expectations he could never understand. Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria was the son of silence. Born into a world that cheered louder for his birth than it ever had for his mother's life, he became, almost instantly, not a child, but a concept, a solution, a symbol. He would never know Maria Antonia. He would never hear her voice, never be rocked to sleep by her fragile arms, never feel her kiss on his forehead before bed. Because by the time he was strong enough to open his eyes, she was already fading. Her warmth, her breath, her presence, gone like a name whispered in wind. The court made no room for grief. Instead, they made plans. Joseph Ferdinand was to be the unifier, the thread that would stitch together two crumbling empires with one clean line of inheritance. His blood, thick with the twisted cords of the Habsburg lineage, was precisely the kind of pedigree that terrified ministers and thrilled monarchs. He was a Bavarian prince, yes, but also a Spanish hope, an Austrian echo, and above all, a placeholder for peace. At his baptism, the chapel was filled with incense and low voices. Nobles bowed, ambassadors watched. The font was marble, the water imported. His name, spoken in the echo of candlelight, was received like an omen. Maria Antonia's name was not mentioned. She had done her duty. She had delivered. She was now gone. The child was passed between arms he didn't know. Nursemaids, advisors, priests. Occasionally Maximilian, his father, would lift him, examine his eyes, nod approvingly. But the child was not meant for parental tenderness. He was being shaped for history. Even as he learned to walk, hands reached for him not out of affection, but calculation. Was he sturdy? Was his head well shaped? Did his jaw bear the signs of degeneration, or would it hold steady? Was his gaze alert? Did his small lungs expand with enough strength to sing an anthem or shout a command? He was measured, weighed, evaluated, never hugged. At age 2, his portraits began. Small oil paintings with stiff posture, vacant eyes, curls arranged by governesses, clothing laced and pressed until the boy looked more like a doll than a living creature. These portraits were sent across Europe. Madrid received copies with trembling hope. Vienna stored theirs beside strategic maps. No one asked if he was happy. No one noticed when he cried. Because his tears were not useful. He was brought up in Munich, a palace of long hallways and colder expectations. His caregivers were instructed in diplomacy, not childhood. He was taught languages early, etiquette even earlier. By age 4, he could name the kings of Europe, but not the birds outside his window. He could recite prayers, but not jokes. He sat at miniature councils before he ever ran in grass. And always, looming behind him, was the shadow of his mother's absence. No one told him about her. Not really. Not what she liked. Not what she feared. Not how she used to press her fingers against her ribs when the coughing began. No one told him that she wrote in the margins of her books or whispered the name of the child she lost before him. He was told her name, her titles, her dynasty, but never her scent, her songs, her sorrows. And so she became, in his mind, a face on a coin, a painting in a corridor, a story told without feeling. He had no memories of her, only impressions, only gaps. But children feel absence more acutely than anyone realizes. They don't always ask. They just know. And in the quiet moments, when the candles dimmed, when the laughter of courtiers faded into cold tile, when the nursemaid closed the door and he lay alone, he would sometimes wake from dreams he could not name, reaching for arms that never existed. He asked once, "Did my mother die because of me?" The priest hesitated, then said, "No, she died because God needed her." But Joseph Ferdinand was not old enough to find comfort in pious lies. He carried that weight, quietly. As he grew, his legacy grew faster. The Spanish court, desperate to avoid a succession crisis, openly named him heir presumptive. Treaties were drafted. Delegations arrived to study his habits, assess his mind, report on his health. He was just 5. But by then the signs had begun. A persistent cough, low fevers, fragile bones. His hair thinned at the temples. He tired easily. Doctors disagreed on diagnoses, but all agreed on one thing: his health was not ideal. One physician murmured, the mother's blood was too narrow. Another said, he is royal. He must endure. And so they pushed him, gently but insistently. More tutors, more protocols, more formal meals. He was not allowed to be tired, not permitted to be unwell. His sickness was inconvenient, his fatigue unpatriotic. Then, just before his 6th birthday, the cough deepened. They bled him, they prayed over him, they fed him broths, boiled roots, dried fruits soaked in wine. Nothing worked. One night, he began to gasp in his sleep. The nursemaid called for the doctor. By the time the man arrived, Joseph Ferdinand was no longer breathing evenly. His fingers were blue, his lips cold. He died in the early morning. No final words, no farewell. Just a silence that spread quickly from his bed to every court in Europe. The reactions were immediate and merciless. Spain panicked. Austria recalculated. France prepared. The War of the Spanish Succession, long delayed by the fragile hope that this boy might save it all, now loomed like thunder on the horizon. He was buried with ceremony. Too much ceremony for someone so small. His coffin was gilded. The eulogies praised his potential more than his person. And no one spoke of his mother. But in that coffin, placed above embroidered cushions and beneath symbols he could never understand, he joined her. Not in memory, not in history, but in silence. A mother who died to deliver him, a child who died before he could speak for her. 2 bodies, 1 legacy, no monument. The world had been waiting. For decades, Spain teetered on the edge of inheritance. Its king, Charles II, was childless, visibly frail, his body a fragile remnant of generations of blood compressed into itself. Europe watched, nervous, breath held, as one of the richest, most powerful empires in the world stood without an heir. The birth of Joseph Ferdinand had been the miracle, the compromise, the final hope to avoid war. But now he was gone. And in the moment his small body failed, the geography of Europe began to unravel. Spain, already fractured by internal rivalries and foreign interference, became the epicenter of a diplomatic earthquake. Vienna blamed France. France blamed Austria. Britain, opportunistic as ever, shifted from observer to strategist. And the treaties, carefully written, painfully negotiated, sealed in wax by ministers who barely concealed their exhaustion, were rendered worthless by the death of a 6-year-old boy. Maria Antonia's name did not appear in any of the emergency sessions. No one recalled the woman who had died to produce him. Her absence was permanent and now politically irrelevant. She had done what she was supposed to do, briefly. But with Joseph Ferdinand's death, her existence became a closed chapter, barely footnoted in the surge of diplomatic memoranda and frantic appeals. The War of the Spanish Succession ignited like dried tinder. It was not a single declaration, but a series of escalating maneuvers. Territorial claims disguised as legal arguments, alliances cloaked in moral language, armies mobilized in the name of peace. In truth, it was about fear. Fear that France would gain too much. Fear that Austria would not step back. Fear that the fragile balance built after the 30 Years' War would collapse under the weight of one broken cradle. The war began slowly. Then, all at once, battles tore across the continent. Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet. Cities burned, thrones shook. Thousands died for claims traced through parchment trails no ordinary soldier could name. From 1701 to 1714, the powers of Europe bled not for liberty, not for justice, but for inheritance. For royal blood diluted by time, for names on scrolls, for empty cradles and vanished heirs. Maria Antonia's son was invoked at times, as proof that the Habsburgs had once tried to compromise. His name appeared in a few speeches, a few letters, but hers did not. Not once. Because the war had grown larger than any woman's sacrifice. In palace chambers and battlefield tents, maps were unrolled, borders discussed, dynasties redrawn. These decisions were made by men in wigs and uniforms, speaking in practiced tones of sovereignty and succession, never of lungs that failed after childbirth, or a girl who wept into pillows after miscarriages no one mourned. Her face was not painted on the banners. Her memory was not sung in hymns. Yet it was her death that allowed the rest to unfold. Had Maria Antonia lived? Had she borne more children? Had Joseph Ferdinand survived? The entire European order might have been rewritten. A single living heir, healthy and politically neutral, could have been the dam that held the tide. But she had not. He had not. And so, the flood came. The irony was bitter. For a woman who was told from infancy that her body would prevent bloodshed, her death triggered the opposite. Her silence, which was praised as virtue, created a void filled with cannon fire. Every kingdom that had once praised her grace now sent troops to claim what her son could no longer inherit. Spain's throne became a prize. Its territories, Italy, the Low Countries, the Americas, were chips on a table. Alliances shifted with terrifying speed. Former friends became enemies. Brothers-in-law raised arms against each other. Every drop of royal blood spilled on the battlefield could be traced, eventually, to the collapse that followed her passing. But still, no one said her name. The War of the Spanish Succession became history's focus. The great men, Marlborough, Louis XIV, Emperor Joseph III, took their place in textbooks, their strategies studied, their portraits restored. Treaties were signed, new borders drawn, new kings crowned. But Maria Antonia's story remained in shadows. No statue was erected for her. No composer set her sorrows to music. No epic poem carried her memory across generations. In death, as in life, she was an echo. Present, but never heard. Necessary, but never known. In Bavaria, her grave was visited once a year by a protocol. In Spain, her portrait was taken down after the war. In Austria, her name was omitted from most public genealogies. She had existed. She had tried. She had suffered. And she had vanished. But the world she left behind had not forgotten her entirely. Not consciously, not with gratitude, but with unease. Because every treaty signed in Utrecht in 1713, every throne secured by compromise, every inch of bloodied ground won or lost during those long years of war, carried within it the ghost of what might have been. And that ghost bore her face, unrecognized, unspoken, but not without consequence. She was supposed to be the girl who healed a continent, a body that would prevent division, a womb that would unify ancient rivalries. But her own frailty, a direct product of the very bloodline she was asked to repair, betrayed her before she could succeed. And no one mourned the contradiction. They simply buried it. They buried her and moved on. But the maps had already torn, and the seams could not be stitched again. Her death was not the anomaly. It was the pattern. Maria Antonia was not the first to break under the weight of dynasty, nor the last to be buried in silence. She was part of a larger truth. A truth dressed in gold, spoken in Latin, and soaked in blood. The House of Habsburg had always been obsessed with itself. For centuries, their strategy had been terrifyingly simple. Marry within, preserve the blood, consolidate power. Cousins wed cousins. Uncles took nieces as brides. Brothers married sisters in everything but name. The family tree became a circle. The jawlines sharpened. The eyes grew too close. The line between heritage and harm blurred into madness. It was a dynasty built not on strength, but on repetition. Maria Antonia was a product of this design. Her father, Leopold I, had married his niece. His own parents had been first cousins. Her great-grandparents had shared more than ancestry. They had shared deformities, seizures, chronic illness, and obsessions with purity that bordered on theological extremism. The Habsburg look became a warning sign. Protruding jaw, heavy lower lip, elongated skull. A face carved by centuries of denial. But the real damage was invisible. The genetics ran twisted and tight, looping into themselves until children were born too weak, too slow, too strange. Infant mortality rose. Stillbirths were frequent. Those who lived often suffered from epilepsy, dropsy, depression, or diseases unnamed in their own time. Monarchs ruled in body but not always in mind. Maria Antonia carried that legacy in every cell. Her lungs, never robust. Her spine, already curved by adolescence. Her blood, so precious on parchment, yet so treacherous in flesh. She had been born with beauty that palace painters praised, but the kind of beauty that came from fragility, not health. Porcelain skin, delicate bones, a quiet voice that never grew loud because it never had the strength to be. The court never admitted she was sick. They called her graceful, modest, pious. They praised her silence, her obedience, her otherworldly calm. But they never asked why she often chose to sit instead of stand, why she turned pale after short walks, why her coughing increased with every season, why she trembled during ceremonies that lasted longer than her breath could hold. She was not weak because she was a woman. She was weak because she had been designed that way. And yet, the system continued. Even after she died. Even after her son followed her into the ground. Even after doctors whispered warnings. After priests stopped denying what they saw in the royal nurseries. After nurses wept over tiny coffins lined in velvet. The marriages continued. Because the Habsburgs believed in order. And to question the bloodline was to question the divine right of kings. Their motto had always been, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." But that marriage was a war of another kind. One fought inside the body. One that killed more heirs than battle ever did. One that left queens hollowed, princes limp, children buried without names. The collapse was not sudden. It happened over decades, like a cathedral slowly sinking into its own foundation. Charles II of Spain, Maria Antonia's uncle, was the final, most visible warning. Born so sickly that no one expected him to survive infancy, he lived a haunted life. He could barely speak, barely eat, barely think without pain. He married twice, produced no heirs, died childless, and still the family insisted on bloodlines over biology. Maria Antonia had been the answer to that. A carefully engineered hope, a compromise between Austrian and Spanish branches. But her womb, so burdened with flags and prayers, gave out before the plan could fully take shape. And no one grieved the system. They only grieved its results. Joseph Ferdinand was remembered briefly, then forgotten. Maria Antonia was not remembered at all. No reform followed her death. No change in marriage policy. No sweeping declaration that the Habsburg line must diversify or modernize. The portrait stayed on the walls. The names remained on the betrothal contracts. And the blood kept folding in, until the bloodline folded completely. By the mid-18th century, the dynasty began to collapse under the very weight it had tried to preserve. Infertility, insanity, infant deaths. A lineage once feared across Europe now produced rulers who could not walk without pain or think without confusion. And as the Enlightenment dawned, with its questions and its science, the truth became too large to ignore. The blood was broken. Maria Antonia's story, though never told in full, was one of the earliest signals. Not a tragedy of one woman, but of a system that sacrificed bodies for borders. A system that confused purity with strength. A system that built empires on the bones of daughters. They called her a mother of peace, a wife of duty, a saintly figure of quiet suffering. But they never called her what she truly was: a warning, one they chose not to hear, because hearing her would have meant admitting that love was never part of the contract, that obedience was enforced through lace and hymns, that motherhood was demanded before breath was assured, that queens were expected to die silently so that maps might live. And Maria Antonia did. She disappeared from paintings. Her name blurred in records. Her face faded into the background of succession charts and royal genealogies. She became a number, a date, a vessel emptied, a silence inherited. Her son followed her. The throne passed to others. The wars began anyway. And the bloodline, once so obsessed with itself, finally collapsed under the weight of its own reflection. A line drawn too tightly, a circle with no air. A dynasty that consumed its daughters long before it lost its crowns. She was never crowned, never ruled, never commanded armies or wrote decrees. But Maria Antonia of Austria was a queen in every way that mattered, except in title. She bled for 2 empires. She carried the weight of a collapsing dynasty in her bones. She whispered prayers into the dark and smiled when she was expected to, even as her lungs turned against her and her body folded beneath centuries of inbreeding, silence, and institutional obedience. She was born with no choices, not in her lineage, not in her marriage, not even in the manner of her death. And yet she was expected to be strong, elegant, grateful. What did we expect from her? To die quietly? To succeed where biology had failed? To become a bridge for nations while her spine curved and her lungs shrank with every breath? We praise queens who conquered. We immortalize those who ruled with iron and fire. But what of the ones who were used up before they ever had the chance? What of the women born to bear crowns they never touched, because the crown weighed more than their bodies could hold? Maria Antonia is not a romantic figure. She is not remembered in epic poems. No national anthem bears her name. Her portrait, if you find it, is stiff, decorative, silent. But behind those eyes was a girl who had no space to cry, no time to heal, no permission to fail. She died as she lived, discreetly, beautifully, and for the benefit of others. And her son, the hope she died to produce, was buried before he could understand what she had given. This was not a single tragedy. This was a pattern, a system, a mechanism that consumed women like her, one after another, generation after generation. And so, as the war she was meant to prevent raged across Europe, as cities burned and treaties shattered, no one remembered the girl who coughed blood into lace and whispered her son's name in fever. But we remember her now, not as a saint, not as a queen, but as a human being. A girl whose only mistake was being born into a story already written. So perhaps the question is not why she died. Perhaps the question is, how many women like her were erased before we learned to ask?